Are you looking to be entertained? I don't know if I can help today. So many questions on my heart and on my brain. I don't wanna just entertain you. Are you looking for distraction? I mean, is that your course of action? Don't get me wrong, there is a time and place for fun. I ain't looking to distract no one, 'cause there's change brewing. No longer is it deep beneath the surface. The way this train's moving is forcing us to think about a purpose. And I'm not scared to sing revolution. The soul won't rest until we find solution. It might take all day and night, all the rest of our lives, but it's worth a try. 'Cause in a few years, our bodies return to the earth, and our bones and blood will become one with the dirt. And I don't know about you, but I want my moves to matter, so the young souls know that love is all we were after. What do you stand for? What brings you to your knees? What do you live for? What are you dying to see? What did you come here for? And what will you leave when you're gone? What lives on is your legacy. What do you stand for? What brings you to your knees? What do you live for? What are you dying to see? What did you come here for? And what will you leave when you're gone? What lives on is your legacy. What do you stand for? What brings you to your knees? What do you live for? What are you dying to see? What did you come here for? And what will you leave when you're gone? What lives on is your legacy. What do you stand for? What brings you to your knees? What do you live for? What are you dying to see? What did you come here for? And what will you leave when you're gone? What lives on is your legacy. I wanna know, what are we fighting for? What are we dying for? Yeah, what do we stand for? Oh, I need an explanation from this nation. Oh, what do you stand for? What brings you to your knees? What do you live for? What are you dying to see? What did you come here for? And what will you leave when you're gone? What lives on is your legacy.
Thank you, Nina. So beautiful. So I'm Jeff Leifer. Welcome, Nina Gray. Thank you so much for starting us off. That gorgeous song. Welcome to Circadian's Life Rhythms Conversation Series. We are in our third program, so we're just getting started. And this is a particularly special one, a particularly timely one, and important. The feedback's been tremendous so far around the program, and tonight will be no exception. A couple of logistical things before introductions. One is we are recording this program. Two is that in regards to the flow tonight, we're going to have two opportunities for questions and answers. So great opportunity to ask Sophia Aguiñaga questions about her work and her worldview and what we're going to hear about as she and Zara Zimbardo and myself enter into a conversation about anti-supremacy and transformation. So two chances for questions and answers. One will come in about 45 minutes and one will come towards the last 3/4 of the program. Please use the chat box if you are online, if you did figure out how to get online. We haven't had a problem before, but it seems that some people are struggling with one of the emails links. So the chat box is here. Let us know where you are and throw in comments and questions. Start sending comments in and questions, and Zara will track them, and we'll have time to select some of them and invite Sophia to share some responses. Let me just jump right to Sophia and then Nina. So Sophia Aguiñaga is our guest of honor tonight, and it truly is an honor to have you here, Sophia. Thank you so much. It means so much to all of us in the circadian community. From day one, meeting you, I was so lit up with just the inspiration of your worldview, of the hard work you've done, and of really the boots on the ground around this work of transformation. So Sophia Aguiñaga is in San Francisco, and she is an author, an artist, an activist around intersectional justice. She is engaged with poetry and philosophy, education, spoken word. She's a collaborative artist, producing all sorts of events that are immersive and creative. Her work it's touching people in all different communities, leaders, organizations. She's a bridge builder, and she's really weaving the connections that are necessary to heal the chasm around oppression and liberation. That's an important bridge. The fear and love dichotomy, pain and pleasure, and the human experience, the humanity behind all of it. I've had the pleasure to read her first book twice now. It was published in 2018. It's called Letters of Fear and Love. And now her work, which is building on that very personal, very vulnerable, very inspiring poetic work, is now focusing on a socio-psychocultural political philosophy called Anti-Supremacy, which we're going to hear about tonight. It's so fresh, so inspiring, and so necessary. Let me quickly, before I turn to Sophia, who is going to offer us a spoken word introduction about anti-supremacy and about her work. Before we start, I just want to welcome so heartfully Nina Gray, an amazing musician who hails from Los Angeles currently. And before that, she was in the Bay Area, where Zara Zimbardo and I reside in the East Bay Area. Nina is a recording artist, a songwriter, a DJ. She's a facilitator, and she's working through the lens of music, the creative inspiration of music that's love-based and message-based and so relevant and so timely in this moment. Her mantra is uplift, unite, and inspire. And it's a vision for a world unified around empowerment and compassion. So welcome so much, Nina. You're such an important ambassador of love and healing throughout the world. So it's an honor. Let me introduce Zara Zimbardo, a dear friend and just supreme thinker and feeler of life's riches and possibilities. Zara, it's a real honor and privilege to have you here. Thank you so much for jumping in as co-facilitator. This is a topic that you've done a lot of work in as a speaker and a teacher. You've written quite a bit on the social construction of whiteness, on media literacy, Islamophobia. You've looked at gender and race and imperialism and militarism. You've done a lot of work over at CIIS, the California Institute of Integral Studies, where you teach courses on anti-oppression, self and society. I love the work that you've done around the White Noise Collective, which is an anti-racist feminist training platform and resource organization. It's really important and powerful. Yeah, it's just, I could go on and on. You've done the work with Partners for Collaborative Change, which is about the facilitation of anti-oppression messaging and content, coaching and narratives. So, Zara, what an honor to have you here as well. Let me just offer now a basic and quick introduction to Circadian, and we'll turn to Sophia. So it's a really difficult and special moment at the same time. I'm looking at messages to see if there are people that can't get in. Yeah, there's some folks that really need the link here, so I'm sending it. It's not news that for Black people and many communities of color, generational cycles of violence and trauma are reinforced and exacerbated by systems designed to perpetuate and exploit those wounds, those vulnerabilities, and the intergenerational trauma that results. So tonight, we asked some deep questions around how can there be meaningful human development when the basic human needs for safety, fairness, and dignity aren't even met. There's no denying that right now we're engaged in a very special moment. Things are truly lit up. So many of us are finally paying attention. Some refer to it as the civil rights movement of our time. The current social uprising brings us into stark focus on the enormous challenges that we still face to redress these horrific inequalities, to address the reciprocity that we as a culture have failed to honor, and the very real opportunity for healing and transformation. But this new consciousness is only a beginning, and that's why tonight there's an invitation to go into a journey and to put into motion a deep inquiry. We're in denial if we don't investigate uncomfortable realities for ourselves, not looking outside for the answer of exactly what to do, but coming together to support our own deep inquiry and journey. It's critical that we develop a curiosity even within uncomfortableness. The Circadian community, regardless of the content or the ecosystem that we are working with, we endeavor to lift fresh voices that are fearless, to integrate fragmented belief systems, and to support the cultivation of each person's own agency. Agency to shape a new human future based on values-aligned pathway forward, with full emphasis on valuing a holistic system. Tonight, we have the opportunity for a far-ranging discussion of Sophia's brilliant work on trauma, systemic oppression, and healing, likely touching on how can we dismantle systems of supremacy while we cultivate a cultural and species-level architecture for immune systems that protect against the future rise of supremacist systems. With that, it's an honor to have you, Sophia. We welcome you, and I invite you to share from your own words.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm going to take a moment and read an excerpt from the philosophy of anti-supremacy that will invite all of you into this world so that we can explore it together. Supremacy. It's present in the contemporary genocide of the Uyghurs, Israel's plan to annex Palestine, the ongoing Libyan slave trade, and in slavery dating back to ancient Rome. It lurks subtly behind a mid-year review when a supervisor recommends that a Black woman should research likability coaches because peers perceive her as too brusque. It rears its head in mainstream standards for human beauty and worthiness of representation in media. It's the foundation of America's industrialized prison complex. Educational philosopher Paulo Freire unveiled supremacy's presence in the mainstream style of education in which an otherwise empty and ignorant student is filled with wisdom from an enlightened teacher. Missionaries visiting indigenous lands to guide otherwise benighted and damned people to their true Lord and Savior, plantations and factory farms. Positivism, which recognizes only Euromodern rationality as science and dismisses conclusions derived from any other methods. Supremacy is the very basis of global capitalism. Supremacy is defined as the state or condition of being superior to all others in authority, power, or status. The supremacist value system is fundamentally extractive. The benefit or value of supremacism comes at the cost of that or those external to the supremacist. So supremacy can be understood in two parts as a fragile and baseless binary psychology rooted in an array of primal and thusly very powerful defense and coping mechanisms, and an extractive, crisis-generating, and self-terminating axiology, which derives psychological and material value explicitly through disassociation from, devaluation or instrumental valuation of, and or outright oppression or erasure of an external entity. To put it simply, supremacy is built on the amplification of false binaries and is extractive toward the disempowered segment of those binaries. These patterns are present in nearly every aspect of society and culture. The obtusity and arrogance of supremacy inspiring prevailing powers to try the same failing formula again and again, never reflecting enough to acknowledge the failures and its inevitable end. Mainstream supremacy discourse in America orbits white, hetero male supremacy, and the conversation often stays localized to America. Appropriately so, given Americas have a perverse and deeply entrenched history and presence of oppression yet to be reckoned with, and white supremacy is by far supremacy's most noxious manifestation. Yet, to truly understand supremacy, its roots, how it expresses itself, and how it's perpetuated by and in our paradigm, we must investigate instances of supremacy in other regions, various timeframes, and at varying degrees of perceptibility. With countless instances of oppression arising across the globe, spanning eras and civilizations, those of us who wish to transcend it must widen our gaze to identify the underlying paradigm in each instance. That paradigm is supremacy. If the globally dominant civilization, as we experience it today, was founded on supremacy, and it was, it is inevitable that supremacy then underlies nearly every aspect of how we engage with ourselves, each other, and the world around us from within this system. In this sense, we are fish in water, and we must call our attention to the water for the sake of our collective healing and liberation. I ask us to take the same critical lens we apply to radically enacted supremacy and its emissaries to the rest of our society and culture, most especially including ourselves. My response to the patterns we see playing out today at the fractal level of predominant human existence is anti-supremacy. Anti-supremacy is the simultaneous process of identifying, healing, and or supplanting the interior human conditions which enable the oppressive and dominative beliefs which constitute supremacism and give rise to its fractal, behavioral, and material manifestations. Identifying, opposing, and eradicating any system which, for its function, requires and or incentivizes an oppressor, supplanting those oppressive systems with systems that have an immune system against and disincentivize oppressive and dominative behaviors, realizing equitable mental, emotional, and material reparations for any deficit endured as a result of the privileges and benefits derived from supremacist systems, and disproving any philosophy that claims an objective binary hierarchy of superior and inferior among any group or category. Anti-supremacy's purpose is to address the root cause of oppression itself. It is a process-oriented theory that seeks to identify and move against the whole of supremacist axiology, which manifests as the social, material, and psychological oppression of some to the social, material, and psychological advantage of others. It also aims to address the trauma inflicted by being heirs of such a system.
Let's just take a second and sit with that beautiful overview and introduction. Thank you, Sophia. It's inspiring, it's innovative. I think I'll throw out a opening question since we're speaking at one level to systems. I know that you've mentioned and acknowledged before a woman who's a hero of Circadian, which is Danelle Meadows. And, or did I say, yeah. And their work speaks to the leverage points in any living system, and speaks to the truth that current paradigms may be pervasive, but they're nevertheless able to be transformed. Given what you've just shared with us, will you build on that to speak to how this piece in the Danelle Meadows worldview interacts with anti-supremacy as a worldview and an approach to this complex problem, and how it relates to the healing of inherited trauma and lived trauma?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. So for those who might be unfamiliar, Danelle Meadows came up with this concept of leverage points. It's essentially outlining the various potential leverage points in any system through which one may be able to affect change. These leverage points are tiered in their capacity to affect change. So as a for instance, leverage point 1 is by addressing people and numbers. Leverage point 9 is addressing paradigm. And I'll give an example to kind of express what this means, which is, for instance, if we think about the concept of diversity and inclusion, we can approach diversity and inclusion by saying we need to get more Black and brown people hired at a company, and we can be explicitly demographics focused. This is operating at leverage point 1, which unfortunately doesn't actually affect a stark amount of change. We may end up with more Black and brown hires at a certain company, yet if the paradigm of the company remains fundamentally supremacist, what you're going to end up with is a high turnover rate. And likely which is actually what we're seeing happen in the tech realm, is a sort of flat line of the number of Black and brown people in the organization, which is to say it's a revolving door. They come in, they recognize quickly, this environment is not for me, and so they leave. And so when we think about the paradigm, the opportunity is to say, well, if the organization, for instance, were to become internally reflective, to acknowledge its own manner of perpetuating supremacy within its processes, procedures, its culture, its structures, et cetera, perhaps even its, hierarchical organization structure, the opportunity to then invite a more diverse community into that environment, which has reflected upon itself, and have them feel welcomed and have them feel represented. And, it would offer them an opportunity to feel as though they belong and thus end up staying in that environment. Hopefully that offers some clarity to kind of that understanding of the concept. And so, as that relates directly to anti-supremacy, as the conversation around systemic racism is expanding across the globe, which is incredible and something we've literally never seen before, it's not enough, I believe, to look at just the people who created those systems, or even just looking at the systems themselves. I don't believe it's enough to look at the regions necessarily that the people who created the system came from. All of these things are important, don't get me wrong. And what I think is perhaps even more important than that is, thinking one about the cultural context in which the systems were created, and then even further, looking at the paradigm the systems were derived from. And the paradigm is essentially synonymous to the mindset. Anything that manifests materially in the world was first conceived of in the mind. Whether that's the mind of a human or any other creature, it must first exist in concept or in idea, and then be manifested externally. And so my perspective is, while of course addressing all the various things that I just mentioned are incredibly important, even more important perhaps is looking at the mindset that these supremacist systems were derived from. Some people theorize that perhaps humans' tendency toward dominative behaviors, toward rivalrous behaviors, competitive behaviors, is the underlying cause for these supremacist systems. And yet, fundamental attribution error reminds us of the perils of assuming that human nature is definitive, whereas in fact, human nature is incredibly multifaceted, it's incredibly contextual, and it's also incredibly malleable. And so my perspective is looking at the underlying question of why would anyone ever aspire, why would a group of people ever aspire to develop a system of hierarchical domination and oppression that is fundamentally extractive, that is essentially self-terminating, suicidal, in other words. Why would that ever come to be? And why would anyone ever seek then to dominate to begin with? What is the underlying cause of that? What is the motivation? Does that answer your question, Jeff?
Absolutely. It gets right into it. And I know you've even used the phrase suicidal extractivism, which I think is bang on. Before I ask Zara to jump in, I can't resist but just link what you're saying right now to Resmaa Menakem's work with trauma survivors. I know that you've acknowledged his work as well, especially regarding the healing of intergenerational trauma. This idea that the response is neither, as we often think, emotional or mental, but rather physical, embodied, right, almost as a protective mechanism embedded in the body, where it develops a holding pattern of sorts. And I wonder if you want to say something to that additional piece.
Sure, yeah. So one thing that I oftentimes personally find to be missing from theories surrounding the cause for supremacist dynamics, and especially, institutionalized and systematized supremacism, is the understanding of fundamental biology in relationship to it. So again, as we're thinking about this sort of assumption of human beings being, inherently dominative and competitive in nature, that gives us the impression of this almost inevitability that no matter what we do, no matter how hard we try, we can assume that at any given point in human history and its future, will be unfortunately fighting against some version of systemic oppression. On the other hand, I'm a poet, I'm an idealist at heart. And so I like to imagine that there's a broader opportunity there. So when speaking to expressly the trauma element, we have to look at too then biological mechanisms, right? To understand how trauma, how the trauma response even comes to be. And so part of that is the amygdala, and it ties, of course, into psychology and false binaries, but the amygdala is this interesting mechanism that essentially, before I even know what an external stimuli is, my amygdala is saying, is it safe for me to engage with this external stimuli? Should I fight or flight? Should I welcome it? Can I eat that? All these various questions are kind of popping up. And so what's interesting about that is in the wilderness, that reactivity makes perfect sense. It makes a ton of sense. Add in, on the other hand, human beings' prefrontal cortex and our capacity for metacognition, and with that social intelligence and reason and planning, and then of course take out the context of the wilderness and put us instead in human civilization. The world of these reactive binaries completely dissipates and unfortunately becomes entirely inappropriate. So for instance, if I'm walking down the road and I see a sweater that I don't like, a reasonable response is not fight or flight. A reasonable response, I don't know, maybe how bad is the sweater? We don't know. And as we're thinking, but assuming it's not too offensive, a more reasonable response is to acknowledge, oh, it's a sweater that I don't like, and perhaps it falls out of my mind and it's not even worth logging. The same is true for skin color, and the same is true for age, and the same is true for gender identity, and all these other, variations of othering that we might otherwise embed. And so what's interesting about that is thinking about how in some cases where humans who of course have the brain capacity to be engaging more so with the prefrontal cortex's capacities of metacognition and of course again reasoning, etc. When we find many humans engaging more so in the psychological developmental aspects of the amygdala's operations and mechanisms, what we start to see is a sort of developmental stunting. That happens when trauma takes place, whether that's at infancy, whether it's in early childhood, etc. Usually people are going through this sort of developmental ladder. Theory of mind is essentially kind of where we're talking about getting stuck. It's the capacity to acknowledge that one might hold beliefs that are untrue, and to be able to reflect on those. And when people get stuck in that developmental stage, oftentimes that capacity for acknowledging that, you know, the belief systems or the, you know, reactions that are coming out of the amygdala's mechanism are actually false, and require a sort of transcending. Yeah.
That's beautiful. That makes so much sense. I really want to dig into this. I'm going to hand the mic over to Zara Zimbardo. Please join us.
Thank you. Wow, there's so much. I feel like everything you're talking about is so densely coiled and could like unfurl endlessly. There's so much that I'm just like profoundly intrigued by in your work. And one thing I want to bring up is around fractals, like how you're talking, if you could elaborate more on that in terms of how supremacy functions in a fractal way, like how is the small reflecting and connecting to the large, which I'm assuming also means that patterns or like work towards liberation may also function in a fractal way. So yeah, I'm curious about how this connection between fractals and pattern recognition, like how are we sharpening our lenses to recognize these patterns around supremacy as they function out there in the world, in our society and systems, and then in here, in our consciousness and our psyches.
Thank you. I would argue that beginning internally is in fact perhaps the more effective route. It's, I don't know about easy, it's easier to witness supremacy in an external context. It's easier to externalize it and to some degree or another sort of disassociate with its perpetuation, to feel essentially as though supremacy is a thing happening to me. I am not supremacist. Surely I'm not. I couldn't possibly be. And so, you know, in my own perspective, you know, and even the way that I came into this work was through witnessing and acknowledging my own psychological mechanisms and understanding kind of how, you know, and this also ties into sort of my first work, Letters of Fear and Love, exploring the concept of, you know, if I say I love someone, how is it possible for me to also hurt them? How is it possible for someone to do the same to me? And you know, as we explore internally, we find in ourselves again, you know, supremacy couldn't exist without it first existing internally. It couldn't have come into reality without first existing in the mind or being conceptualized. And so there is a sort of what I call a meta pattern to supremacy that plays out. And it ties quite neatly into understanding, again, kind of what we drew on earlier, the amygdala's function and the essentially sort of disassociation that happens when we're identifying an external stimuli and whether or not it's safe to engage with it and how precisely. So if it's helpful, what I can do actually is I'd love to just read to you what the meta pattern of supremacy is, and maybe we can unfold from there a little bit more. So the meta pattern of supremacy is essentially binaries driving division, objectification, and disassociation through which inherent value is negated. It's followed by assessment of the disassociated entity's instrumental value, followed by forceful oppression of the entity via either invasive or violent extraction if an instrumental value is found, or altogether erasure if no instrumental value is apparent, followed then by depletion and deterioration of the source of extraction, and even further, often what follows that is a state of emergency addressed by manufactured intervention or life support through which human beings often deem themselves saviors or inventors.
I love it. Zara, can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, and actually, I just want to ask one small clarifying question in relation to this, that Sophia, when you're talking about extraction,
Yes.
I'm assuming that we're talking about extraction from human bodies, from non-human species, and from ecosystems.
Yes. So
labor, land, resources.
Yeah. So what's interesting, I'll call to mind this concept called the Plantationocene. People on the call may be familiar with the concept of the Anthropocene. That concept posits that human beings have become a sort of godlike geomorphic force on planet Earth, that we, in some capacity or another, have the ability to engineer Earth's life support systems in some way or another. On the other hand, the Plantationocene is a sort of counter to that concept, which, as you might imagine, even in just hearing the definition, is fairly anthropocentric. It's rooted in pretty heavy-duty human exceptionalism, which I laugh because I find it a little embarrassing. It's like, oh, really? We're that great? Okay. No. I'm just tracking the evidence that anyway. So the Plantationocene, on the other hand, puts context around human beings' impact on planet Earth, acknowledging that essentially what's happened is that human beings have turned everything into a plantation to some degree or another, which is to say, we're looking out at the world and assessing it. And this is, essentially everything. We're looking out at the world and assessing it based on its capacity to reap the highest possible reward at the least possible cost. And so this plays out in a million and one ways, right? The prison industrial complex. Black and brown people are worth more enslaved and in cages than free and liberated and enfranchised. The medical industrial complex, literally all of us on this call are worth more sick than when we are healthy. A whale is worth more dead than alive. The same is true for a tree. And we see, and so this is what I mean by extraction, is that the only benefit to supremacy, and this is sort of what I was speaking to earlier about the axiology. And when I say axiology, what I mean is notions of worth or value. The axiology of supremacy rests entirely on deriving benefit from an externalized source. There's no benefit to being a supremacist without taking something from someone. The same is true for capitalism. For me to have $11, you have to have 9, right? Like that's the math. There's only one way for it to go. So that's essentially what I mean by extraction.
You covered quite a bit there, Sophia. I think you touched on this. Let me see. I wanted to pick up on Zara's question around patterns and drill under a little bit around some things you've said in your work, which is how the the supremacist construct, with its inability to integrate information, to integrate knowledge, is not that different a pattern from the ones that are leading us deep into ecological crisis. And yeah, maybe I'll just, I mean, that's similar question.
Sure, yeah. I mean, you know, as we think about, I'd have to remember precisely what the name of this is, but, you know, we think about just, for instance, the health of our soil, right? And essentially what a plantation does, you know, or you know, monocropping, right? If we want to call it that, is it strips away the diversity of a landscape to plant one particular thing, like corn, for instance. The soil, of course, eventually becomes unhealthy because the various nutrients it needed from the different life forms and plants that thrived in a more diverse environment are completely erased. What ends up having to happen there is human beings then come in with a sort of engineered solution for giving a little bit more life force to that soil so that it can sustain and grow the corn even a little bit longer, just a little bit longer. It's a very bizarre tendency. And we can see this play out. I mean, again, you know, if we zoom out, this is no different again than capitalism, which is extractive. This is no different than, you know, women being worth more when, you know, we're insecure and uncertain of ourselves. You know, it's, you know, it plays out in just infinite ways. Essentially what we're looking at is, I lost my train of thought a little bit. Essentially what we're looking at is this tendency toward, it's kind of like a virus or a parasite, for instance, right? Which is feeding off of its host and to some degree in the insanity believes that it's thriving because there's a lot of energy there initially to extract from, but it has this inevitable end, which is kind of what I mean also when I say, you know, this self-terminating tendency. And this is kind of what I'm drawing into, you know, the ecological context is we're at this very interesting point with climate. You know, there's this beautiful theory called Gaia theory. Some of the scientists in relationship to that have this belief that human beings have the capacity to geoengineer Earth back into a stabilized state. And again, that's sort of what I mean about the insanity of it, right? Which is to say, if I, as a virus, perhaps am extracting from my host and we get to a point where my host needs life support, there's this interesting sort of arrogance that would ever tell me that I'm perhaps the person to engineer, you know, that life support itself.
In that exact regard, Zara, please bear with me. Follow up. So these binaries that drive division being ultimately self-terminating, you've spoken to it in your work. You've used the phrase artificial maintenance as an approach that's antithetical to nature's own operating system and therefore to our own. Can you speak to that phrase, if you still hold it that way, and what that means?
I do still hold it that way. So it's essentially, yeah, like for instance, as we were talking about the soil, and this is what I was saying, I couldn't quite remember the terminology for, but rather than taking that soil and saying, okay, let's let it go back to its natural diverse state so that it can restabilize itself. Human beings come in and say, well, how about I engineer a solution for this? How about I come up with something that, of course, isn't natural to the environment, inject it into that soil. And the unfortunate part of that, the most unfortunate part of that is it's unsustainable. Because it's unnatural, because it's derived from an artificial source, we must continue injecting again and again and again, eventually until, you know, it can't take any more injections. There is a point in which, you know, soil health is actually entirely depleted and isn't able to be revived.
That's right.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Zara, I pass the mic if you please.
Really feeling what you're saying about, literal soil, and then all of the metaphors for soil, and just the ways that I say we, but I don't want to over universalize, right? Like,
right.
Yes. In particular.
And for clarity, yes, I couldn't agree with you more. I'd love to just address that really quickly. When we talk about we, it is not by any means the royal we. In this context, we're talking about predominant civilization and society, and would love to even just outright acknowledge that there are people who live outside of that context to this day who absolutely do not engage in and with the world in the way that we're describing. And so we are talking about a very particular dynamic here and a very particular set of systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for saying that. Yeah, and I think, like in that vein, that's where some folks have been trying to circulate the term capitalocene, whereas Anthropocene is like, okay, human activity is shaping the earth, whereas capitalocene is like some humans and the systems that they built, right, are affecting things to the point where we're pushing the life support systems to the point of collapse, right, or depleting the topsoil to the point where it can't regenerate. Yeah, and just to remind folks that you can start putting in questions into the chat, which is lovely. Sophia, I'm curious to come back to what you were talking about with dissociation, which I think is a really fascinating dynamic, right? And particularly right now, with the movement for Black Lives, with this profound and sustained reckoning that's happening right now around white supremacy, there can be a tendency, for white folks in particular, to do this distancing and dissociation by looking at the most extreme, overt manifestations of ideologies of racial superiority and inferiority, like neo-Nazis, and say, well, I'm not that, right? Even that term, like white supremacists can be like, well, that has nothing to do with me, that's far from me. And in your work, you're asking us to look about, with supremacist systems, right, white supremacy included, how it's pervasive, ways that it can show up in ways that are extreme and more easy to recognize, but then also very commonplace, like you said, like the water in which we swim. And so I want to ask you about that pervasiveness, and also what can help foster our continual courage and curiosity to keep seeing that water, while we might want to be like, right, do this.
Sure. Well, that's quite an interesting question, because if you were asking me to answer that in relationship to Black, Indigenous, or people of color, I'd have quite a different answer than what I probably have if you were asking me that question in relationship to white folks. So what I'll say is fish and water. So I feel it's important to acknowledge that supremacy in its global predominant context was not developed by everyone's hands. On the other hand, it is perpetuated by everyone's hands. And when I say everyone, again, we're talking about those of us within this predominant globalized context. And what that means is we were born into it. We inherited it essentially at birth. We've been indoctrinated into it, regardless of whether we fall into, if we want to speak in, loosely in binaries, to say whether we fall into the category of the oppressed or the oppressor, and there's all sorts of different ways we could think and talk about that. But we've inherited it, we've been indoctrinated into it, and we perpetuate it. And we perpetuate it not perhaps because it feels good to us, so much as in many cases we have no choice, and the systems that are built around us incentivize us to do so. I say this to inspire all of us, regardless of constructed race or identity constructs of any kind, to acknowledge that we all have a part in this. We all have a relationship to it. Certainly our relationships vary. And as I think about the work that needs to be done, we all have work to do, and that work differs quite starkly. Again, which is what I was speaking to. So if you're somebody with the identity construct of someone who's white versus, an especially white male, and especially white male capitalist, right? Like there's kind of layers to a hetero white male. Like the list goes on, able-bodied, et cetera, layers of this, versus people who contrast those identity constructs. Yeah, the work is going to be different. I think what I'll say in terms of Black and Indigenous people, we have no choice but to be constantly aware of the water. It's not an option, ever. It's never been an option. That is a privilege held specifically for the people who benefit from the supremacist system of imperialist white patriarchal capitalism. I don't do this work because I think it's the best possible work I could contribute to the world. I do this work largely because I have no choice, right? And frankly, I oftentimes wonder what on earth my creativity and capacity would be driven toward if I didn't have to fight against a supremacist system. And I wonder the same about all of my Black and Indigenous brothers and sisters, because our capacity is thieved by these systems. Our capacity, we have no choice but to show up and fight for our survival and fight for transformation. Now, there's some middle ground for people of color who are non-Black, for people of color who are non-Indigenous, who to varying degrees can align with supremacist ideologies and supremacist identity constructs. For instance, the lighter your skin color, the more, colorism is a thing. And so there's and also if you're a man, it doesn't quite matter what race you identify with or have been identified by, patriarchy, you have the opportunity to kind of engage with that element of supremacist benefit. When we get specifically to white people, which I think is kind of more the juicier of the conversation, in terms of how to remain consistently aware of the water, my perspective is that the only opportunity to do that is to take yourself out of it. What I mean by that is that the construct of whiteness it's a delusion, it's an invention. It literally doesn't exist. We agree to it, in part, well, not even in part, likely in whole, because it was literally violently enforced upon us. And so I think about it like this. White delusion is sort of like someone hallucinating that they're in a meadow, even though they're in the middle of a very busy street. And the rest of the world is saying, hey, and especially Black and brown people are saying, hey, we're in the middle of a really busy street and we're probably gonna get hit by a car. And the person hallucinating that they're in a meadow is saying essentially, I'm in a fucking meadow. And you're gonna agree with me that I'm in a meadow. And if you don't agree with me and act as if I'm in a meadow, I'm gonna kill you and your whole family and everything that you love. And I'm gonna make it so that you never have the opportunity to build wealth. And if you do build wealth, I'm gonna take it from you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Pulling oneself out of that delusion, I'll be honest, it's not work that I envy, but it would start primarily, one, with education. I think the historical context of white supremacist domestic terrorism that has taken place in America is largely misunderstood and not even acknowledged, right? That Nazi Germany in part was inspired by aspects of American law is something that people oftentimes don't even know or hear about. and of course, there's like this really interesting way, that our schooling system, our education system sort of indoctrinates people into this delusion by disassociating it from like, Nazi Germany, and doesn't like put it in context with all these various global things that were going on at the time. And so education is a big piece of it. Learning, what is your actual history? What did my ancestors do? How did my ancestors benefit from it? Why would my ancestors ever have invented the concept of, I'm in my own mind debating if I should say this word outright, but I think I'm going to. Why would someone's ancestors invent the concept of a nigger? And what was their motivation, and what was their purpose? And if I believe in whiteness, I must also believe in that, because they contrast each other. And so what is my motivation in believing in this construct? What is my motivation? And how do I benefit from believing in the existence of these things? And how is it possible that I believe that I can believe in whiteness and not also its contrast? In my own perspective, I would encourage people to take questions like that as potentially writing prompts, right? And explore this internal landscape. I mean, I've written about this before, that the work is scouring every inch of one's internal landscape for the tendrils of supremacy and domination that create and perpetuate the systems that oppress. And to also acknowledge the most deeply unfortunate aspect of the sort of white supremacist delusion is that it deludes white people into believing that they are not also oppressed. They absolutely are. And perhaps even more so than those of us that are subject to it in a different way, right? Because the truth is in my mind and in my heart, I feel free. I've never been deluded by the white supremacist ideology. I've never bought into it. I've never once believed that it's true. I have, because of this, the capacity to envision a new world, right? Because I'm not deluded by it. I have this capacity to envision and then move toward a world that doesn't function based off of oppression. I can imagine that likely being much more difficult for people with a white identity construct.
It's gorgeous, Sophia. Really. It's in and of itself, it's liberating to name that, I think, for everybody. I'm wondering about an improvisation for a moment and going to Nina unplanned. I don't know, because there's so much there. Mm-hmm. I really am wanting it in my body fully. How does that feel to you, Sophia?
I love it.
Really?
It's been dense. I get it. Okay. Yeah, let's.
No, it's so densely good. And Zara is in touch with me too, saying maybe some music too. So great. Nina, if unexpectedly, would you be open to it?
I would love to. I would love to.
That's a lot, and I want to just sit with it.
Sure. Share the song called Freedom, to land on the note that you shared, Sophia, about rejecting this ideology, being in keen observation of it, but not in interpreting it and owning it, and that ability to imagine and vision something new. And hey, what if we retold the story? Remember the glory of all of these differences. And hey, what if we rewrote the script? Let go of all that bullshit in our heads. And hey, what if we laid down our weapons? What if we stopped pretending hatred was justified? And hey, What if we raise the bar up, demanded a little more out of our lives? 'Cause I've always dreamed about freedom, freedom. But I know we'll never be about freedom till it belongs to all of us. Oh, yeah. Men have talked for years on war and peace. They talked themselves blue and red in the face. Men have built walls where there could have been bridges held. Men created race to separate. Blame it on this lack of urgency. Blame it on just having better things to do. But as we rise together in 2020, turning a blind eye is something we must refuse. 'Cause I've always dreamed about peace and harmony. But I know we'll never be about peace until there's justice in these streets. Oh, 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 'cause I've always dreamed about freedom, freedom. But I know we'll never be about freedom till it belongs to all of us.
Thank you, Nina.
Thank you.
Zara, how about you and I read some questions from our community? You can start.
Certainly. So one question from Sammy is saying, social and environmental impact efforts frequently fail to escape the trap of supremacist ideology as they navigate the paradox of advocating for their approach while maintaining a practical perspective on the experience of their beneficiaries. How can people dedicated to the effort to ameliorate our society and systems do so without falling into this dynamic?
That is a big question. I think what I'll speak to is the imperative of local representation. It's, you know, modernity is like a really interesting thing, right? Thing, if we want to call it that. That's certainly trivializing it, so forgive me. But modernity as a concept, you know, this concept of development and you know, developing countries, et cetera, all of this is, you know, pretty flat out a colonizer mindset. It's a mindset of saying, you know, I'm going to come into a culture, a context in which I've not been immersed, of which I have no fundamental knowledge, no mental, emotional, and or spiritual connection to, and make what is perceived as an objective assessment of what's needed in this context. I just heard about this project going on in Guatemala where, this white man, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but is basically trying to build, this railway up to the top of a mountain, which is sacred indigenous land. And, the indigenous people there are saying, you're just trying to make money off of us, like talk to, and of course in social environmental impact efforts, the goal isn't to make money. And I understand that, but, maybe what I'll do is I'll draw on a different example. There's an example where in Afghanistan, some soldiers that were stationed there noticed that women in Afghanistan were walking many miles to get water from a well to bring it back to their community. What they ended up doing, they perceived this as a problem, and without, asking questions about the local context, ended up building wells in, the towns that they lived in hopes that, they could help alleviate the need to travel far to get that water. Shortly thereafter, they found out that the wells were being poisoned, did some investigating to look into who was poisoning those wells, and it was the women. What they didn't realize, because they hadn't actually had any local representation or deep consideration of local context and need, and the inevitable differentiation and thought process and approach to solving any problems, or even what is perceived as a problem, is that these women, in many cases, were using the time of that walk to remove themselves from abusive households, to get respite from abusive relationships and dynamics. And that was a time for them also to bond and to talk and to commune with each other. And so what I would say to that question, is how unbelievably important and imperative, in fact, local representation really is to efforts like that.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Sammy. I'd like to offer a follow-up comment before taking another question for Sammy's question as well. Just thinking about a lot of the executives and activists that I work with in kind of a coaching capacity, thinking about the power of simple technologies like witnessing, sitting in council, learning about reflections and projections, withholding and owning our projections, practicing that has, in my experience, led to the creation of the kinds of clarity that, Sophia, you're talking about, where a context really emerges, like the intelligence of the dynamic that emerges when we do engage, when we do make sure other voices are at the table or acknowledge when they are not, and endeavor to engage at that level. And when we look at learning as a relational practice, even within ourselves, and then ourselves as a system and in nested systems that go from, the personal to the planetary and all the scales in between. I really think that there are some very simple technologies that are social technologies, social architecture, that have to do with community and engagement and understanding who am I when I let down and dissolve the identities that I'm so closely attached with, including wanting to do the right thing as an environmentalist, or as an impact investor, or as a change agent. Thank you, Sophia, for that answer. Zara, maybe I'll read another question from Kenan Salinero. And Sophia, you have touched on this. How does one break out of complicity? It seems to include both courage and some clarity around the specific lever for change that Daniela Meadows has referred to in her thinking about systems. How does one break out of complicity? You have touched on that, but maybe more goodness on that.
Sure. Well, I think it's reasonable initially to acknowledge that all of us are complicit, meaning I literally can't go buy an avocado without contributing to someone's oppression. That's just, I mean, unfortunately, the globalized context that we're in today, regardless again of race or whatever other elements of identity construct, we're unfortunately deeply complicit, and I would argue in large part probably by force. We only have so many options to thrive and survive without being entirely marginalized and left in a pretty dire state. And so acknowledging that one is complicit is certainly, I think, a good start, and thinking about the various ways that comes into play. But I think there's also a deep importance in asking oneself the questions, and again, I did speak to this a little bit, but I'll expound on it a bit. The questions of, like, if I'm white, for instance, how precisely do I benefit from that? I mean, literally list it out, right? Take some time to list out the various ways that you experience privilege from your whiteness, and think about the ways that your family has benefited from these constructs, and think about your mental emotional attachment to that identity. Again, identity, white identity, race in general is invented, it's constructed, it's hallucinatory, frankly. There's absolutely no material basis for it in reality whatsoever. Let's be very clear. Race is an entirely invented human construct. We built systems around it, and so it's materialized or manifested in certain ways, but in terms of like a biological basis, there is none. There just isn't. And so exploring, without my concept of race, who would I be? As we talked about, for instance, with my own self, I explore, if I weren't a Black woman, where would my energy be going? Who might I be talking to? What relationships might I have? How might I differently perceive community? What schools might I have gone to? It touches on literally every aspect of our lives. And so I think a deep exploration of that is really the only way to kind of begin that process of alleviating the various aspects of complicity in the systems and structures.
Thank you, Sophia. Sophia, with your permission, I'd like to read a short excerpt on that note from your book, your very personal book of letters. Would that be okay?
Sure, yes.
It's short, and it goes like this. I want to transform myself and aid in the transformation of others. I want to plant seeds and nurture them with patience and willingness to let go when appropriate. I want these new growths to spiral outward, every frightened, lost, confused, and uncertain soul crying out, there is no correct way to live. Belief systems are simply a manifestation of human desire to define and express our place in and connection to the universe. Captures it from a very personal perspective. Zara, can I invite you in again?
Sure. So much gratitude for what you're sharing, Sophia. And with what you were just saying, I so appreciate, as like a North Star of ongoing practice, right? That shift from defensiveness to ongoing curiosity. Mm-hmm. Like you said, to keep getting intimate and familiar with that internal landscape. So instead of saying like, no, I'm a good person, not me, to be like, how is this living inside of me? Yeah. Right? How is this living in my world, in my relationships? How is it shaping my imagination? How is it living in my body?
Yeah. And, just really quickly, I'd love to speak to that and call out that if any of us are more attached to being perceived or understood or witnessed as a good person than we are fundamental change will never change.
Right.
The reality is if I want you to perceive me as a good person, that means I must then deny everything within myself that opposes that reality. Um, let go of those attachments, right? I mean, because they are absolutely some of our biggest obstructions. Our need to be perceived in any particular way, frankly, but in direct relationship to this conversation, our need to be perceived as sort of like one of the good ones is its own immense hurdle and obstruction to change.
Absolutely.
Amen.
Thank you for naming that.
Mm-hmm.
It's so helpful to have names, right? And just all of the ways that attachment, as you just said, shuts down the questions.
That's
and doesn't
right.
allow for that living into the questions. I'm just seeing also there's just a lot of love being expressed in the chat.
Oh,
um,
I'll be excited to look at it later.
yeah. Sophia, I want to ask on a on a personal note in terms of your background, in terms of the different lineages of thought and practice that inform your work. And you draw from and engage with so many different disciplines, right? And so many different fields of scholarship, right? Weaving it together, right? So that we have this very interdisciplinary and multidimensional understanding of anti-supremacy. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about, your lineages of what animates you in your scholarship and activism and your different ways of knowing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't have a degree. I am unlikely to acquire one in this lifetime. I am infinitely patient in some capacities and have very slim patience in others. And, my experience with westernized education and that system and the institution were that I don't operate very well within it, in part because I learn best by engaging directly. I'm sort of like, I learn by doing. And that construct is, as I talked about, Paulo Freire, his concept of pedagogy, it being this sort of, imagining that a student is empty and must be filled by a teacher who is surely much more wise than they. And I swear, if only it worked that way, it could be much more simple. But Lord, yeah. And so my process and journey has been that of deep and immense introspection, which is one of the reasons I think I lean so heavily toward, encouraging other people to go on their own journeys. Just as, my goal is largely not to arrogantly assume I have any answers, but to inspire people to inquire, which is precisely how I came to, my own revelations or understandings of the things that I'm sharing with you today, especially the things I put on paper. And so, the process for me has been a deep practice of introspective writing, journaling. Growing up, I've been writing since probably kindergarten, maybe earlier. And looking at myself and trying to understand, again, very early on, I had the underlying questions of, how is it possible someone who says they love me can also hurt me? And as I grew and saw myself repeating those patterns, asking, how is it possible when I know how it feels? How is it possible that I can do the same thing? And that inspired me deeply to try and understand the mechanisms of my own internal landscape, to be able to put a name to them, to be able to deconstruct it and put it back together. And there's a deep intuition and a deep, I have a deep relationship to what I call the muse, which is sort of like, creative energy that comes up and out that I couldn't generate if I tried. It's, you know, it's like so much of this is up to her. Half of what I'm saying is you know, and so, yeah, it's very deeply embodied knowledge as opposed to intellectual knowledge or way of knowing, and very introspective in nature. And also in a way, you know, much more vulnerable, because a lot of the conclusions I've come to have not been derived from reading it in a book somewhere, you know, and so it's this somewhat embarrassing trial and error process of checking my theories against reality again and again, you know, and there's a deep vulnerability in that. Yeah.
Beautiful. Maybe a slight follow-up, if I might, Zara and Sophia. You know, Sophia, you and Zara and Nina are authors, you're artists. You mediate narratives and worldviews through creativity and expression. And it brings me to thinking, it's kind of a two-part question, thinking about media, where, you know, there's just been stereotypes based on skin color forever, racial supremacy ideologies reinforced and perpetuated, white savior tropes, I mean, you name it, and reinforcing these ideas that there's vulnerabilities on one side, insecurities, traumas, and wounds that are taken advantage of on the individual and collective levels by these systems of supremacy. And I'm thinking about media for a moment and wondering about even things like extrajudicial behavior by police who have been exposed to mediated stories and narratives and caricatures. And also, many of us are in the Bay Area where technology and in other areas is scaling at a rapid pace beyond our ability to know what its implications are on humanity and on the planet. And in our conversations, Sophia, well, I think we've talked a little bit about how technology can offer a kind of manufactured consent, where places like Facebook and other social mediated platforms, we might give up our power. We might have a filtered worldview. So just curious if you would bridge from anti-supremacy to the lens of anti-supremacy in media and technology. Big question.
That is a good question. Sure. So what comes to mind for me is what comes to mind for me is the sort of curation of media, meaning there's a wide, vast world of reality taking place at any given point in time, sort of infinite, based on what I've heard. Haven't seen it with my own eyes, but I'm banking on it being true. And what's delivered to us through media is this like really interesting pinhole. It's literally just that in comparison to, you know, the vastness of the reality that's going on outside of it. You know, I had just such a bizarre experience in realizing a family member of mine who's a Trump voter and lives in, you know, and lives in the Midwest. You know, I raised to that person a question around like, are you really comfortable, for instance, with President Trump making it legal for people to discriminate against transgendered individuals and not offer them health care if they're sick? That family member said, no, that's crazy. He's doing what? And this bananas revelation of just how curated, how even more curated than I had originally imagined the media actually is. And so, you know, with my own experience working with some technologists, you know, in the past, and just realizing how like the algorithms of media give us more of ourselves, and take us deeper into our our bubbled ideologies, right? And makes it in so many, I mean, this whole like concept of like the right and the left and like right, I mean, so much of that is propaganda, when in reality, you talk to most people, there are some shared values, certainly different approaches to achieving the reality of those values, and don't get me wrong, but there are so many shared values, and the way that it's posed to us is so divisive, and I believe it's intentionally so. Yeah. Again, like you said, your question is quite big, but that's what it draws to mind to me is just how the media is oftentimes used to generate and perpetuate one, supremacy, but then also, of course, our incapacity to bridge the gaps between these binaries that, these false binaries that we perceive and are displayed to us.
And I'll just say that your work and Nina's work and Zara's work, they really hold the promise that mediated narratives need not make people afraid of each other, but inspire each other and bring them together so that we can, just like in the Donella Meadows comment, we can reveal truth and lead our way to transformation. Thanks, Sophia. Zara, maybe I can ask you to read a question or ask a question, please.
There's not exactly other questions right now in the chat, but a couple comments to bring up. One is saying, again from Kenan, saying, I've recently been introduced to the idea of clowning as an access to the place we are unique and mistake-ridden, to invite the exodus of shame around uniqueness and being wrong, giving access to exploring the edge of oneself without having to hide one's embarrassing wrongness. Yeah, there may be something there to engage with around shame and how it relates to transformation or transmutation of these systems.
Yeah, well, I've long witnessed this very interesting relationship between shame and learning, which I find to be so deeply unfortunate, because learning is quite properly the way evolution takes place, right? Like that is literally the mechanism through which I'm able to grow and change, is to reflect on myself, recognize that I have broccoli in my teeth and say, oh, but I can take it out. Okay, cool. And so, I think about it in this way of sort of like, do I get angry with a child for not knowing how to tie their shoes? No, I teach them. I'm happy to be patient in their learning process because they didn't know. Certainly, now, don't get me wrong, I think the dynamic in the context of racial constructs and how violently they're enforced is, admittedly, I think a little bit of a different context that requires a little bit of a different approach. But what I would say first and foremost is I couldn't agree more. And through whatever mechanisms, clowning or, again, like for me personally, it's like this very daily sort of lived process of trial and error, which comes with a great many opportunities for embarrassment and iteration on how I show up in the world. But learning is in and of itself one of the most beautiful capacities human beings have. And whether that's through acknowledging one's complicity in systemic racism to, how can I be a little bit nicer or kinder in my day-to-day life? And frankly, we're asking the same question in both. One is a little bit more systemic in nature and broader in nature and has, a grander impact than the other. But the work of anti-supremacy, anti-racism, that whole construct is at its base, how do I be and do better in the world consistently? Yeah, and getting really comfortable, I think, with recognizing that we've been all walking around with broccoli in our teeth at different points in time. And, you know, for me, the process of being called out, whether it's by myself or someone else, I find myself to be quite grateful for it because, you know, I could have walked my whole life with that broccoli in my teeth, but I had a friend who told me, again, whether it's me or somebody else, I find a lot of gratitude in those moments. Even though there is a little bit of embarrassment upon reflecting on oneself, but that's the way the ego works, right? Is it doesn't want to be seen. We don't have to live into that embarrassment. We don't have to identify with it. We can feel embarrassment and keep it pushing. You know, it's okay to feel embarrassed and to move forward without it, you know, without attaching to it and it turning into shame, I think.
Love it. Beautiful. I know that many animal species clean each other's teeth, and we need to help each other.
You got the right picture. Yeah, that's
Sometimes walking
exactly
around,
what I mean.
I got an entire souffle of broccoli going on sometimes. So.
Well, and there's something there also that seems to, thank you for the broccoli souffle image, that relates to what was just being brought up around media, right? And this constant bombardment of images and messages and narratives that can uphold different worldviews and different ideologies and different forms of othering. I'm thinking of, for example, and Sophia, with what you were saying of Jay Smooth, who's a cultural critic, video blogger, where he's advocating a shift from the tonsillitis paradigm of race discourse to the dental hygiene paradigm. Right? So instead of saying like, oh, you know, I went to a workshop a decade ago and I had all my prejudice removed.
Right.
When someone's like, hey, there's something in your teeth, right?
Okay.
Because we're constantly absorbing all of these toxic messages, right? We're bound to have stuff in our teeth. And that when someone points it out, you wouldn't say, that's impossible. You know, I did a deep clean, like 1998.
I went to an unconscious bias course 5 years ago. There's just no way that I'm still racist. It's impossible.
Right, but you can get at those notions of like purity, right? Or cleanliness, instead of like, this is, again, like you keep bringing up, right? This is like ongoing practice.
Right.
I love it, Zara, because it puts the emphasis on engagement. You know, there's like awareness, and there's inquiry, and there's engagement, and some deep work that sometimes might be uncomfortable, but with creativity and support and community, it leads us to clarity and truth. And as you said early today, Sophia, that's going to be liberating, not just for those who are victims of oppression, but for oppressors, and that's it's a good thing.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll read a question
I want
here.
to add also
Yeah, please.
humility to that list.
Yeah.
Of just humility seems to be this that's leading through so much of what you're saying, and that humility is not the same as humiliation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right on.
You know, and I think it's important to sort of draw on some of the tendrils of what I'm hearing you to discuss, like reminds me of certain aspects of white supremacy culture. Purity is like a big aspect of that, right? And so, you know, the reason I'm pointing this out is simply to say, for those listening who are curious about that internal exploration, like thinking about constructs like that, like where did that come from? Why is that there? Do I actually believe in that? First of all, is purity even real? Is that even a possibility? And so, yeah, I just encourage folks when you bump into these beliefs like that, again, we're speaking back to sort of like the, you know, am I one of the good ones? Like these attachments to like being a certain way or being perceived a certain way, exploring like, why do I even feel the need to identify with that? Where is that coming from?
I love it. And it speaks to the systems level, as you always do, from the personal and the vulnerable and the, you know, the humility of humanness to the systems level, where I know in my little worldview, working with, say, impact investing, working with healing integration and spiritual, psycho-spiritual growth, there's a lot of bypass, tons of it.
Yes.
And it's a huge problem, and it's insidious. And it's not about making it wrong or being in judgment of it. It's the water that we swim in with these systems that are perpetuated with these narratives and mediated in certain ways. And at the root are the same issues that you've been helping us to get clear about. And more importantly, to say from here, where we can go to build up these antidotes, these systems of resiliency, of learning, and invest in that kind of social infrastructure that we need so desperately. It's heartbreaking to think about children inheriting this trauma. That's how it works, and that's how it is working. That really breaks my heart, just to say it. I want to acknowledge a dear brother, Lance, who sends in a question. Is it reasonable to look at identifying with supremacy as an addiction? If so, how do we support addicts to move into acceptance, to begin the process of learning and reprogramming? We've really been talking about it. That question came in quite a while ago, but it's a good one. I think we talked to it. And someone else says, are we flossing every day? So that metaphor is going to live on.
I hope so.
Whether we, yeah.
I'm looking at all of you like, I see some brow sleep there. I don't know.
we need smiles. Zara, I turn to you in the last few minutes in case you want to speak to a question.
Oh, I thought, did we want to get into Lance's question?
It's up to you, Sophia. What do you think about addiction as a way to relate and hold supremacy as we're talking about it, meaning it?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I would say the answer to some degree is yes, in that it's a deeply rooted tendency that, we have deep associations to. We, especially those that identify with the identity constructs that are perceived as supreme, right? That is, white, hetero, male, able-bodied, etc. I could imagine indeed that it is an addiction, and in part because of the benefits that are derived from it, the immense benefits that are derived from it. And, in the way of supporting people who are addicted to that, if I might be frank, I think it is the work of white people to support other white people in coming out of that addiction. That is not the work of Black community. That is not the work of the Indigenous community. That is not the work of other people of color. Essentially, as a Black woman hearing that question, the question is how, and you're asking it to me, so that's kind of where it comes from, and so the question is like, how do I support someone in aspiring toward less harm to me? The answer is I don't. I leave because it's dangerous there for me, right? If I'm honest. And I ask for you to do the work you need to do and to find a support system that probably does have somewhat similar identity constructs to you, and figure out how you're able to support each other through that process. But as is true in any support and community, encouraging and enabling transparency and humility and vulnerability and openness, and offering each other space and opportunity to share and be witnessed without shame and without judgment. And with encouragement and with intention. I could not possibly encourage more finding, a therapist who works specifically within these constructs and ideas. Yeah, that's what I think about that.
Thank you, Sophia. Gorgeous message to our white community of committed folks to do this work. And I also want to say to Lance, I hope that I did not misrepresent your question, as you are a Black man. So just to just to illuminate the question with more context.
Thank you for that. That's
Limitations of
interesting.
technology. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's interesting, and a little bit different perhaps. I think, for me personally, the way that I approach it is having compassion for those who have that addiction, which is to say, I can see how that came to be, but also simultaneously knowing that the work of supporting someone who is aspiring toward less harm to you or me could potentially be very harmful. My own experience has been in some cases that it can be a sort of act of self-harm to try to remain in close proximity with someone. And, because we are oftentimes the object of the supremacist delusion, being the person to sort of help someone tear down those constructs can lead to a lot of projection in my own experience. And so, I think it definitely depends on your relationship to those people, but that's, kind of my perspective and approach.
That's really helpful. Really helpful. That's a juicy one that can go all night. I love it.
Oh, sure. Yeah. There's nuances to it. Absolutely.
Zara and I are thinking, Sophia, what a great moment to invite Nina back in, this kindred family and messenger and ally. So Nina, if you would share, we'd be grateful.
I'd be happy to. I'm drinking this in appreciation and respect, and this element of humility just highlighted for me. And I had a different song planned, but the coalescence with this movement and stay-at-home orders, shelter in place, and COVID does offer a divine opportunity to continue what you state so beautifully, Sophia, is the work that starts internally. And so this song was written at the beginning, or in March, during the beginning of shelter-in-place orders, as a reflection of that journey of introspection, and I offer it to the group as an invitation to keep going, to keep going. Wake up in the morning, get that water boiling for my tea. Yeah. Open up the blinds, let that sunshine light up my body. Write my morning pages and hit that meditation and find that space of gratitude. It's been a long time coming and I'm finally making room for a bigger me, for blossoming, for the rising seas inside of me. It's been a long time coming and now all I really got is time. I pray that I make the most of the moment and don't let it pass me by. And do I have all the answers? No. Will I keep asking questions? They never said it was easy, but I'm committed to finding the silver lining, the silver lining, the silver lining. Thank you.
So gorgeous.
Thank you.
We're coming towards the conclusion. That's an integrative technology, Nina Gray. Thank you. Zara, would you kindly ask a final question from you, and we'll go around the table and move towards close.
Yeah. Whew. What a gift, all of this incredible thinking and singing and words are together. I feel incredibly full and brimming over, and with just to acknowledge the time that we're in right now, of pandemic, of racial justice uprising, where all kinds of systems are being revealed in different ways, where our interdependence is being revealed in different ways or becoming more vivid. And Sophia, I'm thinking of what you were just saying around therapy. And it's like on the national level and global, it's like our country is going through some therapy right now, right? Where all kinds of approaches, all kinds of medicine is being offered, all kinds of elite tantrums are happening and resistance, right? There's this reckoning as perhaps some of these supremacist systems maybe, like this might be a time of hospicing and possibility of new growth. And just wondering what your greatest hopes are for this time that we're living in right now, and all of this possibility of like so many decades of work that in some ways is coming to fruition now. And the question in Nina's first song, like basically, what are you dying to see?
Thank you for that question. You know, like I mentioned earlier, I'm a poet. I'm an idealist in my heart, and so what I'm dying to see, you know, in relationship to this particular moment, it will be very interesting to see what plays out. Of course, in my wildest dreams, it leads toward large scale change. I mean, we've already seen in some capacities quite large scale change, even in that, you know, more people are engaging with the abolitionist framework more than ever. I mean, which, you know, not long ago at all was seen as just, you know, as fringe as possibly could be. And so large scale change, certainly, but I mean at the systemic level where people perhaps dig a little bit more into the understanding of socialism as a potential transition toward communism, and breaking down some of the constructs around communism that, you know, like unfortunate propaganda that we've been fed about, like what that even means and what that even is. You know, I dream in my wildest dreams there's an opportunity for the division of classes that we've witnessed. I mean, essentially, you know, one of the best ways that, you know, if we're talking in the context of Marxism, one of the biggest ways that the bourgeoisie maintains its power over the proletariat is by convincing the proletariat that it is its own enemy. And to not so much at varying classes think about, you know, the people exploiting our labor, and the people exploiting. I mean, the exploitation is not just of humans, of course, as we've talked about. It's the land. It's as wide scale as it could possibly be. And so, you know, in my wildest dreams, there's an awakening, especially of the upper class within the proletariat, you know, that we've all been fooled, we've all been duped. And, you know, some of these constructs have been put in place specifically to protect the bourgeoisie from an uprising, you know, of the proletariat class. And so, you know, if they divide us, of course, yeah, they, you know, there's these sort of buffers that have been put in place. And so in my wildest dreams, there's a sort of collective awakening to realizing how unbelievably much collective power that we have when we're able to break down the divides we've been manipulated into believing into and living into in our day-to-day lives. Yeah, I would say that's it.
So beautiful. Thank you, Sophia. Yeah, that collective potency feels so ripe. It feels like a floodgate is the opportunity here to have the floodgate that should always have been open, be open and be opened. And at Circadian, we're holding it like you've just been saying, and like Zara's just been saying, a collective initiation of the heart. Mm-hmm. And in that regard, I'd like to read a quote from your book on fear and love, because this initiation of the heart goes right to the heart. As a teacher of mine used to say, before he would start his work, he's an indigenous teacher from South America, he'd always say, "Directo corazón," we're going to go right for it. Here's the quote from Letters of Fear and Love by Sophia. "Love does not come to bring comfort. She is armed with a double-edged sword. She is a strict and expectant teacher. She does not coddle. She equips. She does not wait. Love comes to open and unearth. She inquires, dissects, examines. She tests and tries. She calls each weakness by its name. She displaces passion with nauseating excitement. She is every frightening and awakening discovery. Love suffers and suffers and suffers. Love heals and heals and heals." That's an excerpt from Letters of Fear and Love. And with that, if there's any final words, Sophia, although in answer to Zara's question, that was so gorgeous, so it's open choice. But I just wanted to share that because it's so personal from you.
Thank you. Well, personally, I feel complete. Thank you for sharing that, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Sophia. Nina, thank you so much. Zara, thank you so much. Community, thank you so much. We're sorry about some of the challenges in the beginning, and we'll have this material available for anyone that wanted to be here and couldn't be. Much love to you, Sophia and Nina and Zara. Blessings.
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody.
Thank you so much.
Okay, more to come, more inquiry, more engagement. Follow us at Circadian, please, and support the two groups that are in the invitation. Support those two groups. This is a fundraising opportunity, please. They're wonderful groups, and support Nina and support Sophia's work as well through our portal. Blessings.